Welcome back to Bergson and the Holographic Theory of Mind, ongoing series. This will be part 28, The Chinese Room, which is philosopher John Searle's famous thought experiment attempting to disprove the possibility that AI, or computers, can ever equivalence mind. So we'll be looking at Scott Aaronson's critiques. Aaronson is a quite brilliant quantum computing expert and theorist. So we'll be seeing meet chauvinism, double standards, bringing the complexity, the speed of operations, the notion that evolution already did it, so why can't we? Emergence, virtual machines, and his very related critique of Roger Penrose. And we'll be seeing that there's a monster in the room. There's something in the room that truly worries the AI theorist. And it's going to come down to a totally different device. In researching the theory of quantum computing, particularly the brilliant Scott Aaronson in his book, Quantum Computing Since Democritus, 2013, I hit again in the book the Chinese room with respect to artificial intelligence. Quantum computers obviously bringing something to bear on that perhaps. And Aaronson's reaction. I was kind of stunned. This incredibly brilliant computer scientist who defeat me handily on any number of chosen grounds, addresses the issue in such a narrow mode. The brain can only equal a computer, a metaphysically blinded way, I'm sure reflective of his entire intellectual class, being the AI theorist, computer scientist guys, that it's yes, stunning. Yes, there's a monster in that room, and evidenced by the vast discussion and the still ongoing discussion, it still really bothers these guys. Why? Well, we're going to see. We're going to go through his reactions. This issue is so central to AI and mind, debated so heavily, and I've touched it a couple times, but never specifically addressed it, so here we go. So the Chinese room argument was introduced by the philosopher John Searle in his paper Minds, Brains, and Programs. It was published in the prestigious journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences in 1980. So he argued, suppose a computer has a way of a computer, and it takes Chinese characters as input. Then, using the instructions of a computer program in the computer, produces other Chinese characters, which it presents as output. Suppose, says Searle, this computer performs its task so convincingly that it comfortably passes the Turing test. So we put a little screen there and a Chinese speaker person, and the Turing test passing would mean the machine convinces our Chinese speaker that the program itself is a live Chinese speaker, in actuality a real Chinese speaker behind the screen. Searle then supposes that he is in a closed room. He has a book with an English version of the computer program, the rule ledger book in the picture there, with sufficient paper, pencils, erasers, and filing cabinets. Searle could, he says, receive Chinese characters through a slot in the door or on the little screen on the wall, process them according to the program's instructions, and produce Chinese characters as output. Says Searle, if the computer had passed the Turing test this way, it follows that he could do so as well, simply by running the program manually. Searle asserts there's no essential difference between the roles of the computer and himself in the experiment. In other words, he's perfectly equivalent to a computer. Each simply follows a program, step by step. Each produces a behavior, which is then interpreted as demonstrating intelligent conversation. However, Searle would not be able to understand the conversation. For him, I don't speak a word of Chinese. Therefore, it follows that the computer would not be able to understand the conversation either. In 1990, Searle made the argument more formal. He had 3 axioms. The first, programs are formal or syntactic. A program uses syntax to manipulate symbols and pays no attention to the semantics of the symbols. It knows how to move them around. It doesn't know what they stand for or what they mean. For the program, the symbols are just physical objects like any others. And if we take the definition of syntax I used to use in my little doctoral thesis back in 1976, syntax is rules for the concatenation and juxtaposition of objects. This is purely spatial manipulation. And again, when we look at Chomsky's syntax rules up in the top right there, again, we're simply moving symbols around. If we want to generate the man stirred the coffee as a sentence, we could simply pick a verb from the pool, stirred, for example, coffee, the man is from the noun pool, and generate a sentence via those rules, simply telling us how to concatenate and juxtapose these symbols, which are, in effect, nothing more than abstract objects. Minds, he said in his second axiom, have mental contents, that is, semantics. That is, as we'll see very shortly again, what he liked to call intentional content. So we have the content, the intentional content of the man stirring the spoon. That is the semantics behind that sentence. So unlike the symbols used by a program, our thoughts have meaning. They represent things, and we know what it is they represent. Then he said, number 3, syntax by itself is neither constitutive of nor sufficient for semantics. This is what the Chinese room thought experiment is intended to prove, he said. The Chinese room has syntax because there is a man in there moving symbols around, namely Searle. The Chinese room has no semantics because there is no one or nothing in the room that understand what the symbols mean, that grasp that event, coffee stirring. Therefore, having syntax is not enough to generate semantics. So his first conclusion, programs, computer programs, are neither constitutive of nor sufficient for minds. A fourth axiom, brains cause minds. Again, brain behind, the cause behind the intentional content of that mind, the man stirring the coffee with the spoon. And 3 more conclusions. Any other system capable of causing minds would have to have causal powers, at least equivalent to those of brains. Any artifact that produced mental phenomena, any artificial brain, would have to be able to duplicate the specific causal powers of brains. And it could not do that by just running a formal program, that is, manipulating abstract symbols. The way that human brains actually produce mental phenomena cannot be solely by virtue of running a computer program. Now, the room stirred up an enormous discussion from the beginning. And it still does. It hit a very deep nerve, which is why we're going to look at Scott Aaronson. Most of the discussion consists of attempts to refute it. The editor of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, Stephen Harned, said at one point, the overwhelming majority still think that the Chinese room argument is dead wrong. And Pat Hayes, who was struck by the sheer volume of the literature that has grown up around it, said, the field of cognitive science ought to be redefined, quote, as the ongoing research program of showing Searle's Chinese room argument to be false. Pat Hayes, I should note, was a co-author with John McCarthy, authors of the frame problem, as we discussed before, in 1969. So this was his quip. The Chinese room argument is that central. There are tons of arguments. We're just looking again at Aaronson's reaction, but in fact he incorporates a whole bunch of these arguments. And again, Aaronson I consider a premier mind in the computer field. Just one comment first. In Searle, we've seen a focus on symbol manipulation. This just sounds like good old-fashioned AI. And one could ask, well, haven't deep learning and neural nets eclipsed all of this symbolic manipulation stuff? And the difficulty is, first of all, deep learning is just symbol manipulation itself. It's just, as we saw in number 23, matrix algebra, calculus, still symbols. Yeah, it might take Searle eons to perform the matrix calculations, but in principle it could be done. Then the in principle point is the issue, as we shall see. Second, AI veers to GoFi in any case. We saw this again in the deep learning segment, number 23, with Ben Goetzel. His architecture was ultimately pure symbolic, trying to integrate neural nets, but all ending at symbolic manipulation. A presentation I just saw with Josh Tenenbaum from MIT, same thing. He notes all the same kinds of problems with deep learning as far as their quote-unquote recognition goes. In other words, complete non-recognition in reality. Remember the cars parked example, where there's no real true recognition, and goes to the same form of symbolic architecture, ultimately trying to integrate neural nets. But if one looks at that architectural diagram here, again, it's got working memory in the brain, operating system module 2 there, working memory, visual routines, attention, and the cognitive core, module 3 on the right, intuitive powers, geometry, intuitive psychology, but it's all symbol manipulation. Of course, you got the very top towards symbols, long-term planning, abstraction, language. They're trying to develop what a symbol might be in cognitive development, but this is all GoFi based. So back to Aaronson, or on to Aaronson. So Aaronson's critiques. Aaronson notes Turing's second paper, where the Turing test is defined. What, he asks, is the main idea of the paper? He says, as I read it, it's a plea against meat chauvinism. He says, sure, Turing makes some scientific arguments, some mathematical arguments, some epistemological arguments, but beneath everything else is a moral argument. Namely, if a computer interacted with us in a way that was indistinguishable from a human, then of course we could say that the computer wasn't really thinking, that it was just a simulation. But on the same grounds, we could say that other people aren't really thinking. They merely act as if they are thinking. So what entitles us to go through such intellectual acrobatics in one case, that is the computer case, but not the other? Of course, the red is another perfectly inconsequential comment. Meat chauvinism. What entitles us, that is, to treat computers differently from brains? We're already at the core of the problem. The answer is nothing. If you have no alternative model of the brain. Or, again, if you have little to say in what semantics is. Or, if you have no theory of consciousness, which is really the same thing, because semantics and consciousness are bound together. And especially if consciousness is just equivalence to biology, as per Searle, as we'll see. Or if you can't say what causal powers actually means. Remember, the brain has causal powers that somehow create semantic content. Well, what does that mean? These deep lacunae were and are the unfortunate weakness of Searle. Perhaps we're just kind of looking at an unfortunate order of events or of divine providence. The 1976 thesis of yours truly here had a definition of a syntax-directed processor, namely a computer, versus a semantic-directed processor. The title was Time and Memory, the Basis for a Semantic-Directed Processor, and its meaning for education. This is all built on Bergson, of course, and his holographic model of the brain. Not to worry, no one's going to see this gem. And by gem, I mean kind of a diamond in the rough of lots and lots of rough. But just saying, imagine if Searle's 1983 paper had been on semantic-directed versus syntax-directed processing. In other words, with a clear model of semantics and its tie to consciousness. And within it was the Chinese room as a subset, as an example of the latter, of syntax-directed processing. And within the brain is a modulated reconstructive wave. In other words, I'm just looking at a different possible series of events. But very likely, the intellectual field wasn't ready for that in any case. So Aaronson goes on. This moral question, this question of double standards, is where Searle, Penrose, and every other strong AI skeptic comes up empty for me. Remember, strong AI is simply what, in fact, AI is really wants to go for, namely equivalence human mind and then exceed it. One can indeed give weighty and compelling arguments against the possibility of thinking machines. The only problem with these arguments is that they're also arguments against thinking brains. But again, if these weighty arguments say nothing about what the brain might actually be, what can one say to Scott? Not much. And he goes on. So, for example, one popular argument is that if a computer appears to be intelligent, that's merely a reflection of the humans who programmed it, the computer programmer. But what if humans' intelligence is just a reflection of the billion-year evolutionary process that gave rise to it? Now, what he likely means here by evolutionary process is, in effect, evolutionary algorithm. And we discussed earlier in part 7 on AI and evolution, how AI and evolution are implicit supports of each other. Evolution is explaining the creation of beetles, for example, successive improvements of beetles. AI, that is the intelligence or algorithms behind the creation of beetles or of mousetraps, for that matter. But the latter, creating a mousetrap, is clearly the problem of common sense and knowledge. Again, remember the illustration. We take a whole bunch of components, a pool of components, string, toothpicks, boxes, cheese, razor blades, rubber bands, and out of that we're given the task to create a mousetrap. And we can do so, for example, one that looks like a cross trap, a cross probe, using the pencil, rubber bands, box, etc. Tripwire for the cheese. Again, as we noted, this is also the problem of analogy, because we're creating a gigantic analogy to a crossbow via all these components. And the problem of common sense knowledge and the problem of analogy are one and the same problem. But obviously, beetles are going to be even worse. Living, breathing, other bug-catching beetles. So AI is stymied by this common sense knowledge problem, as we've been discussing. Yet evolution theorists routinely invoke AI-like algorithmic terminology to explain the evolution of, say, new beetles from form to form to form. Little phrases like Dennett, generate and test. So we simply generate from new biological components. Again, we have a pool of components. These are biological components, and we simply create a new beetle and test it, or mix and match of possible components. Various other problem-solving like phrases. As though evolutionists have solved the problem of how to build a mousetrap from a component pool, or equivalently new beetles, as though they have solved common sense knowledge. Neither has done so. Neither evolution theory, or AI. And the difficulty is because this requires an entirely different form of intelligent device. So this argument of Scott's is very, very weak. It's question-begging in reality, because you're simply saying evolution did this as though you somehow know evolution did this, but you don't. Seth Lloyd, another quantum computer theorist, sees the universe as a vast quantum computer. We noted before, where evolution is basically algorithmic. We simply seed this initial universe with a tiny bit of code and off it goes. So, in essence, the universe is a cosmic scale AI device. And it then generates, just like beetles, butterflies, birds, and bullheads. So if Scott is invoking a non-algorithmic, non-computational process, no, again, if he's invoking a non-algorithmic, non-computational process, then the universe, in its evolutionary process, is not acting as a computer at all. It's a non-computational device. And therefore, rather, for creating beetles or anything else, bullheads or butterflies, as a quite different form of device. In other words, unless he's trying to claim that the universe is indeed another form of computer, just the same old Turing class device, his argument actually works against him in this case. And going on, what frustrates me every time I read the AI skeptic is their failure to consider these parallels honestly. The qualia and aboutness of other people is simply taken for granted. It is only the qualia of machines that's in question. Now here I'm going to agree. Philosophers deserve the disrespect they're implicitly getting here. Aboutness. Are you seriously calling this a theory of perception? Remember, just intentional content. The coffee cup, which is a perception, is intentional content. Or its aboutness. Same difference. This is not a theory of perception. What is philosophy giving the AI guys? This is nothing. Give me a break. And again, qualia. There is no theory because it is not grasped that the problem is actually the origin of the image of the external world. This image, the coffee cup, it's totally qualia form at all. This is what has to be explained. Now, if one thinks I'm being hard on the philosophers because their subject isn't perception, I have to disagree, because conscious perception is the problem of consciousness. This is the premier problem. The origin of the image of the external world is the problem of consciousness. Bergson saw this. But as a little anecdote here, the first explication of Bergson I ever managed to get published, that little article there, Bergson, Perception, and Gibson, in the Journal of Consciousness Studies 2000, was almost rejected by a reviewer, bless his heart, because it was about perception, not consciousness. This is how blinded philosophy is to the actual problem. Now, Chalmers at least briefly understood the qualia problem applies to any architecture, neural or computer. But in his current embrace of AI and of the singularity that is, Chalmers is unhesitatingly predicting that in 100 years or so, we'll reach the singularity where AI equivalences and equals human consciousness. He seems to have lost, and I think in reality has never understood his own problem and the implications thereof. Chalmers himself would be another subject. An alternative model of perception was given by Bergson. Heidegger, with nothing that can tie to science, however, became, in the philosophy world, the greatest of the 20th century. Bergson buried. So deserving of this implicit critique and disrespect? Yes. In fact, I know it as I've been looking at Macy's book, The Origin of Time, which I mentioned I just discovered in the last number 27 on Heidegger versus Bergson. In perusing chapter 4, I discovered that Heidegger totally mangled Bergson's conception of time as expressed in Time and Free Will, attempting, therefore, and achieving, along with many others, the burial of Bergson. Just saying. So, how might a strong AI component or proponent respond to Searle, to Scott? Well, you might not understand Chinese, but the rule book does. So the rule book gets quite an enhancement of responsibility here. Or if you like, understanding Chinese is an emergent property of the system, consisting of you and the rule book, in the same sense that understanding English is an emergent property of the neurons in your brain. Now, Searle might respond, well, just memorize the book. Just memorize the rule book. Then there's no system other than your own brain, but you still don't understand Chinese. The AI proponent shoots back. Well, there is another system in this case. Supposing you memorize the rule book. We distinguish between the original you and the new simulated being brought into existence by your following the memorized rules, a being whose only relation to you might be that it happens to inhabit the same skull. And continuing with the AI proponent shootback, that response might sound crazy, but only to someone who has never studied computer science. To a computer scientist, it seems perfectly reasonable to say that one computation, say a Lisp interpreter, can conjure into existence a different unrelated computation, say a spaceship game, just by dutifully executing the rules. Sorry, but this simply smacks of a form of desperation, really. I mean, I took computer science. I've coded virtual machines, tiny ones. That's all you need to know. I was in software development for nigh on 40 years. Are you seriously going to say that just because one program executes within another program, something magical has occurred? Something that takes one program beyond the realm of computer code? That is beyond syntax rules and symbols? Really? I mean, you can nest VMs, VM within VM within VM, nest them to infinity, virtual machines. You can nest them to infinity. There's no magic that's going to happen. No matter how deep that nesting goes, it's still just computer code. I mean, this one's a real stretch, but moving on. Now Scott proceeds to, shall we say, trash Searle's argument. That is the general form, the general structure of the argument. He says, look, I don't know whether the conclusions of the Chinese room are true or false. I don't know what conditions are necessary or sufficient for a physical system to understand Chinese. And neither, I think, does Searle or anyone else. But consider it as an argument. There are several aspects of the Chinese room that have always annoyed me. Number one, the unconscious appeal to intuition. For example, it's just a rule book. What could a rule book do? Number two, the double standard The idea that a bunch of nerve cells can understand Chinese, well, this is self-evident. Yet the idea that a bunch of computer cells and registers, etc., can't is not self-evident. 3, the unjustified impact of just imagery, that is just the imagery of the room itself. This sidesteps the whole problem of computational complexity. We visualize someone push slips of paper around with no insight. But how many slips? How big the rule book? How quickly must it, the rule book, be consulted to converse in real time? Now, I know this is a slight conflation of problems here. The question is comprehension, not whether Searle can actually confuse someone enough to pass the Turing test. Yes, Searle would be too slow to pass the Turing test. But can he understand Chinese no matter how sped up his operations are? That's the real weight of the argument. But if you took this as saying, in order to pass the Turing test, Searle would have to be incredibly sped up, moving at light speed in order to pass the Turing test, then the question becomes, well then, in this speeding up, can Searle comprehend? So, number 1 and 2, yes. Indeed, Searle has no clue how neurons do language, comprehension. He has no clue of the nature of comprehension. He is just appealing to his faith in biology, that understanding the biology will do it all. But the third argument, how quickly, that is to say, if we speed up Searle, won't he understand? This we have to look at. How quickly? This argument always amazed me. Consider performing the syntax rules to obtain a sentence. On the right, the man stirred the coffee. Why would it possibly make any difference how quickly or slowly you run these rules? You end with the same result. You generate the string, the man stirred the coffee. Yes, if you were looking at the brain as a true, concrete, dynamic system, a system of forces, energies, fields, a system which is imposing a scale of time. Again, for example, in our normal scale, we see the buzzing fly. That is, the brain is imposing a scale of time on the external field surrounding us, such that flies are seen as buzzing beings, as opposed to flapping their wings slowly like butterflies. Or yet another possible scale that could be specified, the fly is an ensemble of electrons. But you are not. You're not looking at the brain in this way. There's no such thing going on. The operative, keyword operative dynamics, is simply this motion of abstract symbols or objects in an abstract space and an abstract time, that is the time of instance, where each of those symbols is simply existent, so to speak, for an abstract instant, and then gone as the next arise. We'll talk about that more in a second. There's no forces, no energies, no fields involved. It's simply this abstraction of this abstract motion in an abstract space, that is syntax. To be clear about the operative dynamics, as simply the motion of abstract symbols or objects in an abstract space, an abstract time. I've noted this before. The concrete nature of the device, the actual forces and fields and dynamics is irrelevant. I can have a Turing machine with an infinite tape, an abacus, a register machine composed of beans and shoe boxes. It's only important is that the abstract operations are carried out. The nature of the device does not matter. For an AC or DC motor, for that matter, the dynamics, the forces are essential. You don't make an AC motor out of rubber bands, toothpicks, shoe boxes, and beads. But what if the brain must have exactly such a concrete dynamics? What if this is all important? Well, it is absolutely imposed. Firstly, just picking one thing to impose a scale of time upon experience. A buzzing fly versus a heron-like fly slowly flapping his wings, versus a cloud of electrons, which is the fly at another scale. But again, running a computer faster or slower is irrelevant to the abstract operations employed in the Turing computational framework. Only the proper movement of the abstract objects is effective. But the impact of the scale of time is indeed the fundamental intuition behind this argument, this speeded up argument. Consider the effect of LSD on language comprehension. As time slows in one's experience under LSD, the sentence, "the man stirred the coffee," becomes so strung out in time as to become nearly incomprehensible. The is so far away in time from coffee. It's like the man stirred the coffee, but it's that the is infinitely far away after a while, and you can make it worse and worse depending on the amount of drug. So LSD, in all likelihood, has something to do with altering the chemical velocities underlying the dynamics of the brain. The wings of the buzzing fly in the LSD experience, going at 200 cycles a second, 200 wing flaps a second, also slow down. So the continuous time extended motion of the fly, say for one objective second, has been spread out. By objective, I mean objective time, as the second hand moves one tick. We have 200 cycles of wing beats in that one tick of a second, measured by the clock in the objective world. It's now being spread out into, let's say, from a buzz to 200 slowly moving up and down wing beats, which we could watch unfold forever. Remove the LSD, and this is compressed again to the buzzing. But all this occurs within a fundamental memory, giving continuity to the fly's motion and his wing beats. So there's a memory giving continuity to this experience. Again, I note objective time is defined by noting simultaneities in space, purely simultaneities in space. For example, a recurring position of the Earth with respect to the Sun is considered a year, or the motion of the clock hand from point space to point space. But subjective time is a function of the brain's dynamic imposition of scale upon the universal field. But a framework that is syntactic in principle, and syntactic only, has no such resources. There is no natural relationship, no in-principle relationship to the operations in this framework and the speeding up of those operations. Abacus, Turing machine, even quantum computer, it makes no difference to the computation. Nor is there the memory in which the compression / expansion of the time extended motion of the fly occurs. Rather, again, going back to the sentence, man is generated and then it's gone. Man is present as an instant and then gone to the past. This third word comes along, is generated, and then gone into the past. Coffee is gone. The man stirred the coffee. Each object disappears into the past. An intrinsic feature of the system is an abstract time, that is, the time of discrete instants, where each instant comes and is replaced by the next and falls into the past, therefore, the non-existence. So there can be no continuity in which scale would even make a difference. So this argument of speeding up is utterly irrelevant, if you see what I'm saying. Because there's no continuity in the first place in a syntactic device that's manipulating abstract symbols in a purely abstract time where each instant comes and goes into non-existence, each state comes and goes into non-existence, there can be no continuity in which scale would make a difference in the first place. But Searle, to my knowledge, doesn't make these considerations. If he had, the speed-up argument would not still be being made in 2013, as though it had some relevance to the Turing framework. But perhaps most succinctly, Searle gave zero consideration to the problem of time, or to the problem of our perception of continuous time-extended events, like, well, a sentence. That's a time-extended event. The coffee stirring itself, the concrete perception of coffee stirring is a time-extended event. I'm not sure any of this exists as a problem for Searle. I just haven't seen it. Nothing even close to this was discussed in his 2015 book on perception. That his time got like perhaps 3 sentences. And yet, there we see the buzzing fly versus the heron-like fly, fundamental aspects of perception. Any time-extended event demanding explanation, and not even a thought. Again, for Searle, since the 1600s, there were like 7 great philosophers of perception. And Bergson was definitely not one. In other words, Bergson's great model of perception, and more importantly, his incredible considerations of time don't exist in Searle's world. And this is having an horrendous impact on the whole discussion of the Chinese room. So this, however, is the essence of the problem with syntax. Shove a symbol that is an object into a computer register. It's gone into the past, into non-existence when the next one arrives. There is no possible continuity, no possible spanning of symbols coming and going over time to make a whole. Even if all the objects, now one by one as you create the man stirred the coffee, even if they're all stuck in a computer memory, they're now just all static, sitting nicely in their memory words. How is motion perceived? Or even if it's somehow translated in a whole bunch of symbols that somehow represent coffee stirring, again, how is motion perceived? Are you going to introduce a scanner scanning all of these objects in your computer memory? Okay, well then, again, you've got the infinite regress. How does the scanner register motion? And the scanner behind him register motion? The problem is elementary, and it was never touched. I guess in Searle's mind, again, biology just takes care of the whole problem. Aaronson continues, if each page of the rulebook were equivalent to 1 neuron, we'd be talking about a rulebook the size of the Earth. Its pages searchable by a swarm of robots traveling at the speed of light. Put that way, maybe it's not so hard to imagine this enormous entity might have something we'd call understanding. Again, just magic. More speed with undefinable reason why. More complexity of rules. Never with a definable criterion of complexity, by the way, for some magic transition to understanding. As Stuart Hameroff noted, and as we talked in the core discussion, you have to have a definable threshold for complexity. But in truth, complexity of symbols and rules is in actuality just irrelevant, as earlier noted, because in this framework there is no possible continuity in this abstract time, no whole is obtainable. He goes on, of course, everyone who talks about this stuff is really tiptoeing around the question of consciousness. Now this will lead him to the subject of mathematical proof, but we'll go on to this later. What bugs the AI folks so badly about Searle in his room? Frankly, I think they know they do not truly understand language comprehension. They know Searle is right about the symbols and rules. That is, it's not truly sufficient. They have a pure abstraction. They actually have no ontology, no physical reality. Just these abstract rules and symbols, which, as I pointed out, can be implemented on anything. Something more seems needed, some other ingredient. But they know Searle has no clue what this is either. You can't just say it's the brain's causal powers and think you've defeated them. You can't just say it's biology and think you've defeated the AI folks. They're not going to take that, and I don't blame them. So why the biology? Searle cannot really say. He points, for example, to the background knowledge, which is to say context knowledge for sentence comprehension, but that's no help. Why can't AI do that too? There's no answers there. Hence the stretching defenses by the AI folks. Virtual machines. Evolution did it, so can we. Speed of operations, complexity, emergence. And aimed right at Searle, meet chauvinism. Anything to save their classic framework. But they suspect, more likely fear, that consciousness is somehow involved, the needed ingredient. But Searle is unhelpful here as well. It too is just biology. In fact, I'll link a small link to a little talk that Searle gave that, again, just stresses biology, but no help whatsoever. So let's stop here. And now let's address the real monster in the room. You're tiptoeing around consciousness. Well, you're tiptoeing firstly around perception, and thus around experience, and what experience is. There can be no idea of what the understanding of language is without this. The man stirred the coffee with the spoon, our linguistic sentence. But this is an event. The man stirring the coffee with the spoon. A linguistic string is nothing but a mediating device to move the brain into the perception of an event. Yes, mentally. The event has a structure. Perceived event has an unstructure, invariance laws, as we've noted multiple times. All those nice invariance laws define an event. Velocity flow fields, adiabatic ratios, inertial tensors, acoustical invariance, texture gradients, ratios, flows. All these existing, again, only over time, not in a static instant or as a bit that can be transmitted along the nerves. It's time extended. It's ongoing over time. That's how I can even have these invariants. So you must know in the first place, how is such an event perceived? Because language is trading on perceived events. If you don't know how events are perceived, you're never going to have a model of comprehension of languages specifying events. Pretty obvious where you begin. This is the starting point of the Chinese room. To ask, how is such an event perceived, is to ask, what is the origin of the image of the external world? Unfortunately, as I've noted already, Chalmers effectively obscured the monster in the room. His emphasis on accounting only for qualia is a misdirection on the problem. Again, the entire image is qualitative. The origin of the image, forms and all. This is the problem for explanation. Throw in the aboutness guys, the intentional content guys, ineffective non-theories of perception. Can one wonder why folks like Aaronson, Arnad, and multitudes more are flummoxed? So, we know there's no image of the coffee cup in the brain, no picture, no photograph, nothing developed there like a photograph. Everything is dark inside, like many theorists like to say. So, whence the image of that coffee cup? Well, this question can be answered, but then we'll be forced to an entirely different model of the brain. Yes, we know that Bergson answered this. The photograph is not within the brain. The photograph is already within the external field. So 50 years before Gabor's 1947 discovery of holography and 85 years before David Bohm's generalization of the holographic principle to the universal field itself, Bergson had posited that the universal field is holographic. So in our little diagram, we have a field, universal field of 6 whole points, 6 points. For each point, the state of each point is the reflection of the states of all other points. And so a field wherein at every point is the photograph of the whole, or in Bergson's phrase, the photograph already developed in the very heart of things and at all points of space, from matter and memory. Further, he had in essence, as we look at holography in retrospect, viewed the brain as a form of modulated reconstructive wave passing through this field. Again, just to review modulation real quickly, again, we have a holographic plate, as in the picture above, and let's say we stored the interference patterns of 3 objects, a cube, a wine glass, and a cup. And the interference pattern is made by a reference wave. So in the case of the cube, we have an object wave hitting the plate and a reference wave of frequency 1. In the case of the wine glass, not yet seen yet, we'd have a frequency 2 reference wave interfering with the object wave from the wine glass and being stored on that plate, and then as an interference pattern. And then in the case of the cup, we'll use frequency 3 as a reference wave, form the interference pattern of the 2 waves at the plate, reference wave and object wave from the cup. These will be 3 interference patterns. But now as shown, we take a reconstructive wave and beam it back through the plate, frequency 1, and what will be specified to the viewer, the rising waves, will specify a cube in space in depth, that is the source of the original object wave. Now if we modulate that reconstructive wave to frequency 2, the specified source will be the wine glass. And if we modulate the reconstructive wave to frequency 3, the specified source of the object wave will be the cup, coffee cup. And we can modulate back again to frequency 1 and now specify the cube. So in this analogy, however, it is the brain that is the modulated reconstructive wave passing through the universal field, where the field takes the place of the holographic plate. The brain then is a very concrete device, a concrete reconstructive wave passing through a very concrete physical holographic field. And it then is specific to a source within the holographic field. For example, a coffee cup with spoons stirring away. There is no image, no photograph being developed within the brain. The brain is simply specific to the source within the holographic field, an event, the coffee cup with spoon. The event, for example, the stirring, occurring within the holographic field, is structured by those invariance laws we noted, as J.J. Gibson described. It is these dynamically changing invariance structures within the field that are modulating the brain as a reconstructive wave, and therefore specifying, well, different events. But the image of the coffee cup is external, right within the field, right where it says it is, and not within the brain. This is termed direct perception. Now, this model relies on and only runs with Bergson's temporal metaphysic. For the ever ongoing transformation of the holographic matter field is indivisible or non-differentiable, to put it another way. There are no discrete instants where each present instant falls instantly into the past as the next instant, the present, arrives. The past being the symbol of non-existence. Thus, the brain as a reconstructive wave can be and is specific to a past portion of the transformation of the field. It's always specifying the past. That is, the indivisible motion of the field carries a primary memory because there are no instants that are falling away into the past. This primary memory feature of the transformation of the field supports the perception of stirring spoons, rotating cubes, and it's not via short-term storage areas in the brain from which such events are disassembled and reassembled in real time. We're specifying past portions of the transformation, indivisible transformation of the field. The memory is being taken care of for us. So the brain, via its dynamics, is imposing a scale of time on this field. Buzzing flies versus slowly flapping their wing like flies. This is all via a real concrete dynamics. It's concrete as a AC or DC motor. This is, wait for it, causal powers. Actual ontology, not just abstract symbol manipulation. As the experience is not occurring solely within the brain, it cannot be solely stored there. We are 4D beings, integrally embedded in the indivisible transformation of the holographic field. So a present event via its invariant structure creates a modulation pattern or wave in the brain that is redintegrative of previous events with the same structure. So the man stirred the coffee with the spoon. Again, a linguistic string is a mediating device, which redintegrates previous experience, specifying a dynamic event, a man stirring coffee with the spoon. I don't intend to go in detail, a whole theory of language here, but we're trying to give the basics for how an event is perceived in the first place, and therefore how language, a linguistic string, can bring about mediation of the inner perception, shall we say, of such an event. In all of this, it's not that a bundle of neurons then is perceiving coffee stirring. We'd have to go into the whole question of subject-object, which I won't go into here. But the bundle of neurons is not perceiving coffee stirring, nor is a bundle of neurons understanding the sentence. But I will point you to parts 1, 2, and 3 at the minimum to understand why that is. So what is required? A device that can perceive coffee stirring in the first place, that can perceive an event over its time-extended flow as a whole, that is, perceive an extent of time. A device whose operational dynamics is concrete, whose dynamics is integrally embedded in the indivisible transformation of the holographic field. But what the computer model is, its operational dynamics is purely abstract. The concatenation and juxtaposition of objects in an abstract space and abstract time. Syntax. Concrete dynamics are irrelevant. Any device will work as long as the abstract operations can be carried out. And if we focus for a moment on that little modern PC on the right, well, it carries with it a certain aura in its modern technological state, with its transistors, its whirling electrons, its electrical dynamics, and therefore it appears that an artificial mind, so to speak, is participating in this dynamics, in this flow of electrons, and thereby gaining a form of continuity. But this is an illusion, because again, the operations that are effective, that are completely independent of this. In fact, can be carried out by the slow Turing machine on the left. It's no more effective than were we say to be running a simulation of a AC generator, because that simulation can't run a single Christmas tree light. There's no effective dynamics in that simulation. And as we've seen, this is all important when we're dealing with consciousness, perception, and ultimately language comprehension, an effective, real dynamics, an ontology. So, continuing, its time then is abstract, this series of discrete instants, where each instant falls away into the past as the next one arrives. It is unembedded in the indivisible transformation of the field. Non-embedded, that is, it's logically completely independent of this indivisible transformation and therefore of the primary memory that this field carries. There is no possibility of perceiving a time-extended event as a whole, as a flow. Again, what is required? A device whose dynamics reflects the invariance structure of an ongoing event. And remembering these invariants are defined only over time in the first place, over continuous time. And you have a device which imposes a scale of time on the holographic field, the buzzing fly flying by the coffee cup. What the computer model is, there's no engagement of invariant structures. Deep learning nets, none. Symbolic AI, none. A scale of time is assumed, namely our normal scale. No other scale is possible, or is thought to be possible. Any new scale would be totally ad hoc. There is no concrete dynamics by which to specify or determine a scale in the model. And given it is pure syntax that the model is executing, the scale of time is actually irrelevant in the first place. None of this was understood by Searle or explicated. No hint of what the alternative device might look like. A device that does not just implement the computational abstraction embedded in the classical metaphysic, where the biology is indeed critical for one reason, because it is creating a concrete reconstructive wave. Hence the frustration of the AI types. The only conceivable thing that a brain can be doing is Turing computation. What is Searle's actual problem? Causal powers? What powers? How? Why biology? One can sympathize. Back to Aaronson. Continuing where we left off. Of course, everyone who talks about this stuff is really tiptoeing around the question of consciousness. Again, repeating the quote. This leads into the subject of mathematical proof and to Penrose's related critique of AI. He notes, he being Scott, that the computer proof of the four-color theorem, it did so by reducing the problem to the tedious enumeration of thousands of cases. So a computer algorithm iterating through thousands and thousands of cases to prove this theorem. We won't go into what it is. But he asked, why did mathematicians look askance at this computer-generated proof? They were not particularly enthusiastic. What it boils down to, and he says, there is a sense in which the theorem has been proved, but there's another sense in which mathematicians understand proof. Theorem, Scott thought, as far as the mathematician is concerned, is not proved by a physical process, no matter how reliable. Rather, when the mathematicians feel their minds can directly perceive its truth. Thus, he thought, there's two ingredients to the anti-robot animus, the robot bashers. First, the direct experience of consciousness, directly perceiving the coffee cup as an event, direct experience, or the belief, and secondly, the belief that if they were just computation, they could not be conscious in this way. This is what he thinks Penrose's objections to the strong AI boiled down to. But nope, this is not what they boil down to. But hold on this for a moment. We'll come back to it. Just note, what is physical? Note, theorem proved by a physical process. But what is physical? The temporal metaphysic we've been discussing with Bergson holds a different definition of what is physical. In the temporal metaphysic, the perception of that cup is yet physical. Reconstructive way within a holographic field, but with a specific nature of time. A different definition of time as indivisible flow. So what is physical is a matter of definition. So moving on. Given these two components, he says, for some people who think this way, granting consciousness to a robot seems strangely equivalent to denying that one is conscious oneself. How to avoid this medius double standard? One rule for ourselves, being nice biological meat, another for robots. Scott's favorite way to resolve the dilemma? Chalmers' proposal. Quote, Chalmers says that if computers someday emulate humans in every observable respect, then we'll be compelled to regard them as conscious for exactly the same reasons we regard other people as conscious. As for how they could be conscious, we'll understand that just as well or as poorly as we understand how a bundle of neurons, back to the bundle of neurons, could be conscious. Sorry, a computer cannot emulate a human. Why? A device implementing an abstract operational dynamics within a classic metaphysic simply cannot meet the requirements. Invariance laws engaged? Not. A reconstructive wave? Not. Imposing a scale of time via its dynamics? Not. Specifying continuous transformations? Not. And so on. I list some to the right. On the meat side, concrete dynamics, reconstructive wave, invariance laws, scale of time, indivisible flow, conscious perception, temporal metaphysic. On the not meat side, purely abstract operations in an abstract space, an abstract time, invariance laws, not engaged, continuity, zero, perception zero, all within the classic metaphysic. Again, I lay out a much larger set of requirements in more detail in number 11. So return to Penrose. Recall, as Scott believed, in the mathematician's mind, a theorem is not proved by a physical process, no matter how reliable. Rather, when the mathematicians feel their minds can directly perceive its truth. So what is the difference between directly perceiving the truth of this? Coffee stirring, a direct perception, a hand, a spoon, stirring coffee, the truth, versus this, an event where a hexagonal form is folded into a three-sided cube and stacked upon a previous cube, make it ever larger and larger cubes. This happens to be Penrose's visual proof of a computation that does not halt, i.e. the halting problem. In this case, the computation is that adding successive hexagonal numbers always equals a cubical number. And so this proceeds in this way. You take the 19 there, a little hexagonal number and fold it into a three-sided structure, almost a cube, lacking a side, and then you start stacking. So if you take the whole process from the beginning, the first cubical number is a 1, 1 by 1 by 1. The first hexagonal number will be a 7. Just like the 19, you'd fold it into a three-sided structure, and then you would stack it, move it right over the 1. It would make a little cube, a 2 by 2 by 2 cube. Now you take the 19, fold it into the three-sided structure, almost a cube, and then stack that, move it right over the previous 2 by 2 by 2. Now you've got a 3 by 3 by 3 cube. Then the next hexagonal number, the 37, you take that, fold it into a three-sided structure, and then stack it right over the previous, making a 4 by 4 by 4. Now, is there any doubt that this would continue forever, making larger and larger cubes? Were I better at making visual dynamics, dynamic visual displays, you'd see this in real time. First, a little 1 would appear, a little bead, and then the 7 would appear. It would fold dynamically into a three-sided structure and be moved right over the 1, making your 2 by 2 by 2 cube. Then the 19 would appear, be folded, and then stacked right over the previous, making the larger 3 by 3 by 3, and then the 37 would appear, be folded into the three-sided structure, moved or stacked right over the previous, making a 4 by 4 by 4, and this would just keep on going, making a larger and larger and larger cube. Again, little doubt that this is a proof that this would never stop. But both of these are events. Both are dynamic transformations over time. Both are described by invariance, as we noted. There's a plethora of invariance laws describing that coffee stirring event. Likewise, there's invariance occurring over the stacking event. The hexagonal number invariantly forms into a three-sided structure. The structure invariantly forms a cube when moved over the previous. Both of these events are perceived as wholes over a continuous change. But this requires a device participating in the indivisible transformation of the universal field, which provides the primary memory that allows these events to be unfolded as continuous forms, shall we say, over a continuous change, such that they can be perceived as wholes. Given a discrete state device, such as a Turing machine, where each state of the machine, or each abstract instant of time, is simply gone, disappeared, no longer exist when the next present state arrives, this is impossible. So no one, in the furious critiques of Penrose, and there were furious critiques. I note in 1990 he published a summary of The Emperor's New Mind, his 1987 book, in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, the exact same journal, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, in which Searle had published The Chinese Room 10 years earlier. That journal has a format where there's roughly 30 commenters writing 1,000 to 1,300 words apiece. And Penrose noted later that he was simply shocked by the fury, the anger at his arguments that mind could not be captured by a computer. So this proof, involving what he termed non-computational thought, appeared later in Shadows of the Mind, 1994. But no one, as I was about to say, in all these critiques of Penrose, ever noted that he was invoking Gibson's invariance being preserved over transformations, dynamic transformations over time. Invariance over transformations. These are the inexhaustible elements of proofs. A quote from Penrose that Penrose saw. This is what he meant by non-computational thought. Thought that does not fit within the Turing machine framework. Yes, this requires consciousness. For this is the perception of whole events over dynamic change. That is, a memory, as just noted, participating integrally in the indivisible or non-differentiable transformation of the holographic field. Not possible in a syntax-directed device that moves in discrete states and discrete instants. And again, I would note that Scott thought that the focus by Penrose in his books on Gödel's theorem as the key disproof of computers as possible minds was just window dressing. And I exactly agree, because what the real burden of non-computational thought is this, what we just said, invariance over dynamic, continuous, indivisible transformation such that wholes can be perceived. But what type of device can support this? Not a computer, not a device operating in the abstract space and abstract time of the classic metaphysic. So we've been exploring Bergson's answer, the division of a device, quote unquote, that is the brain and mind that can support true intelligence and thought. This is my little thought on this subject. The computer science guys, the AI guys, they've made themselves wonderful, awesome experts in matrix algebra, differential calculus, many other forms of mathematics, algorithms, quantum mechanics. But have they read, reflected upon every work of Piaget, for example? That is, the development cognitively of the child, and thought about the significance. There's 14 of his books in my bookcase. I know I'm missing a few. They're all marked up. The works of Gibson, of Wertheimer, Brunner, Lakoff, Mark Johnson, Cassir's Philosophy of Symbolic Forms. I could go on. Penrose, as a physicist, came extremely close to the core, yet expressed what I would consider the physicist's malady when they go into the theory of consciousness, namely that he seemed unaware of the scholarly matrix he was actually expressing, and his critics were equally unaware. The point is, these guys seem fearless and fixed in their AI defense, perhaps because they're just too unaware of what must be explained. Just my humble opinion. Having said this, the origin of common sense, the child's developmental trajectory of cognitive abilities, this is becoming a research focus at places. Josh Tenenbaum at MIT, in a presentation I'll put the link to, a total focus, that is how the child develops common sense, building blocks, building towers, truly interacting with the concrete world, not with Wikipedia text, Google images, the real world. Nevertheless, as we saw in slide 9, he still dwells in the pure symbolic architecture world. That is, he veers toward good old-fashioned AI. He has to. That's all they've got right now. It's the world of pure computations, in other words, where there is no real concrete dynamics. But when one studies Piaget, it is clear that transformations over an indivisible time are critical. Piaget was Bergson's student, and that this is what supports his concrete operations, thus a concrete dynamics within a temporal metaphysic. Without this framework, comprehension in Searle's room is just as unreachable, no matter what the complexity of the symbolic architecture. So yes, this is huge. How to integrate what we understand as computation today with a real concrete dynamics. Perhaps someday the AI folks will come to this. So down the road, still on my standard list here, which I don't quite seem to get to, memory research, physics and the holographic principle, time travel, definitely working on the quantum computing in the brain. It's a difficult a question as to the approach and the level and degree of explanation to take, but still interesting. Or something else, because things keep coming up. So, till next time, we'll see. Till then, signing off.